Somewhere in Virginia, over 1 million pounds of American iron sits rotting in a field. No plaque, no museum, no explanation. This is a Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny H-8, a locomotive that once produced nearly 7,500 horsepower, outmuscled even Union Pacific's famous Big Boy. In the 1940s, nothing on rails could match it. Yet within a single decade, nearly the entire class was cut apart for scrap. How does the most powerful steam locomotive ever built end up abandoned in a field, when what killed the Allegheny was not a bigger engine? In the early 1940s, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway faced a problem that threatened its very backbone. War had turned the rails into arteries of industry, and the Allegheny Mountains stood as both a barrier and a proving ground. Coal was the fuel of the nation's factories, and the Chesapeake and Ohio's boardroom minutes from 1941 reveal a single, urgent directive: move more tonnage, faster, over steeper grades than ever before. The old engines, T1s and H-7s, were already straining, double-heading in pairs, just to inch heavy trains up the mountain. Wartime demand meant there was no room for bottlenecks. Every train delayed at the summit risked holding up a chain of steel, munitions, and coal stretching all the way to the Atlantic. Management didn't want incremental improvement. They needed a leap. The order that went out to Lima Locomotive Works was clear: design a single locomotive capable of hauling 11,500 tons up the steepest grades at speeds that would have seemed reckless a decade before. The board's 1943 minutes spell it out: one engine, one crew, no helpers, and no excuses. The cost would be enormous, nearly $300,000 per unit. But the calculation was simple: a single unit engine would slash labor and fuel costs and keep the coal flowing to the war effort. This wasn't just about power, it was about reclaiming control over the mountains themselves. The Chesapeake and Ohio's challenge to Lima was a test of American engineering at its most ambitious, with the fate of wartime supply riding on the answer. Steel and rivets alone cannot convey the presence of the Allegheny H-8. Its form looms beyond ordinary memory, a 2.666 wheel arrangement stretching nearly 125 feet from coupler to coupler. 12 driving wheels, each 5.5 feet tall, anchor the machine to the rails, while two sets of articulated frames allow it to twist and bend through mountain curves. The firebox, so immense it demanded a 3-axle trailing truck, measures over 9 feet wide, wider than the Union Pacific Big Boys, and large enough to swallow a compact car whole. Weight is measured here in impossible numbers. The H-8, with its tender loaded for battle, tips the scales at over 1.2 million pounds. That is more than 600 tons. An entire freight train's worth of mass concentrated in a single engine. The driving axles alone bear nearly 87,000 pounds each, a load that would crush lesser track. Every inch of the locomotive radiates purpose. The boiler is a pressurized cylinder stretching the length of a city bus, and the coal bunker is stacked high enough to feed the firebox through hours of relentless mountain climbing. In photographs, the Allegheny dwarfs the men who serviced it. Standing beside its wheels, a grown man barely reaches the midpoint. Its builder's plate is mounted at chest height, lost in a forest of steel rods and pipes. This was not just a locomotive, it was an industrial force, designed to overwhelm the mountains themselves. Every statistic, every bolt, every ton builds toward a single question: if this was the most powerful thing on rails, what could possibly bring it down? Numbers alone cannot capture the shockwaves that rippled through the rail industry when the dynamometer charts for the Allegheny H-8 were first unveiled. On a rain-slicked test run in 1944, the locomotive's performance was translated into hard data: 7,498 horsepower recorded at the drawbar. This figure did not come from marketing brochures or boardroom boasts. but from the inked trace of a dynamometer car, rolling behind the engine at 46 miles per hour. In that moment, the H-8 outmuscled every rival, including the Union Pacific Big Boy, whose own drawbar horsepower topped out at 6,290 under similar test conditions. The difference, more than 1,200 horsepower, was not a rounding error. It was a seismic gap, confirmed by engineers, witnessed by officials, and preserved in the archives of the Henry Ford Museum. But the story behind these numbers is more complex than a simple contest of brawn. The H-8's peak was captured on a mild grade, in a controlled environment, with the locomotive pushing toward its absolute limits. Real-world service demanded something different: sustained power, hour after hour, across the brutal slopes of the Alleghenies. Critics argued that the Big Boy's figures were measured under heavier, more punishing loads, and that the test conditions themselves shaped the legend. Yet even with this caveat, the H-8's supremacy in raw output remained unchallenged, a fact that continues to spark debate among rail historians. Horsepower, after all, is both a promise and a warning. The Alleghenies numbers are a monument to what was possible, and a reminder that the measure of a machine's greatness can depend as much on how the test is run as on the steel and steam itself. Blueprints from Lima's drafting tables reveal the anatomy of the Alleghenies' power. At the heart of the design sits a firebox that defies convention, over 9 feet wide, spanning the full breadth of the locomotive's frame. This was no ordinary furnace. The sheer size demanded a radical solution: a 3-axle trailing truck with 6 wheels engineered not just to support weight, but to stabilize a firebox pushing the limits of what rails could bear. The trailing truck, a marvel in itself, distributed the immense load so evenly that the locomotive could glide through curves that would have wrecked lesser engines. The firebox's vastness was more than spectacle. It allowed for a larger grate area, feeding an appetite for coal that turned raw fuel into a torrent of steam. At full output, the boiler operated at 260 pounds per square inch, higher than almost any American locomotive of its day. This pressure was not theoretical. Lima's shop records and test logs confirm the numbers, stamped into the steel and signed off by engineers who knew that every pound per square inch would be needed for the grades ahead. Steam coursed from the boiler into 4 massive cylinders, each measuring 22.5 by 33 inches. Simple expansion, not compound. Lima's engineers chose brute force over complexity, favoring reliability in the face of relentless mountain service. The cylinders drove 12 coupled wheels, transferring power to the rails with a grip that relied on the locomotive's own weight, over 1.2 million pounds when paired with its tender. Each driving axle bore nearly 87,000 pounds, the highest load of any steam locomotive in North America. A large superheater, woven deep inside the boiler, ensured that steam reached the cylinders at maximum energy. The result was a locomotive capable of producing over 7,000 drawbar horsepower in service, with a peak of 7,498 recorded on the dynamometer. Every inch of the Alleghenies architecture, trailing truck, firebox, boiler, cylinders, was calculated to turn coal and water into unstoppable motion. The numbers on Lima's blueprints were not just theory. They were the foundation of a machine built to conquer the Alleghenies, and for a brief moment to outpace every rival on the rails. May 1942. The dispatcher's log from Clifton Forge records a coal train stretching over a mile, 11,500 tons behind a single H-8. The orders are clear: no helper engines, no delays. The Alleghenies crew, veterans of the mountain grades, climb aboard with a mix of pride and skepticism. For years, these men fought the mountain with double-headed engines, each run a battle against gravity and time. Now they stare up at a locomotive that promises to do the work of 2, maybe 3, at once. The throttle opens. Black smoke pours from the stack as the H-8 shoulders its load. Crew diaries from that day describe the sensation as a steady surge, no slip, no drama, just motion. The train begins its ascent, winding through the 13-mile climb to the summit, the firebox roaring with a hunger that devours coal by the ton. The engineer, hands wrapped around the throttle, feels the weight but not the struggle. The dynamometer car, coupled behind, traces out a line that will become legend. 7,000 horsepower sustained, 65 miles per hour reached on the level, every ton accounted for. That spring and into the war years, the H-8s repeat this performance day after day. Dispatch sheets from 1943 and 1944 list train after train, 250 cars, 9 million tons of coal moved in a single year over the Allegheny corridor. The numbers are cold, but the stories are not. Firemen recall the heat of the firebox, the constant rhythm of shoveling, the sense that the engine was both beast and partner. Engineers speak of the Allegheny's confidence, how it seemed to shrug off the grades that left lesser locomotives gasping. The big boy out west may have drawn the crowds, but on the C&O, the H-8 was the workhorse that kept the war effort moving. In the end, the proof was not in the brochures or the test stands, but in the unbroken chain of loaded trains cresting the summit, night after night, with a single engine at the head. For a brief, impossible stretch of years, the Allegheny was everything its builders had promised, and more. The numbers that once justified the Allegheny's creation would, within a decade, become its undoing. Internal memos from the Chesapeake and Ohio Accounting Office in 1949 lay out the new arithmetic in stark terms. The cost to move a ton of coal 1 mile with an H-8 stood at $1.20. The latest EMDF-7 diesel, tested on the same grades, brought that figure down to just 95 cents. On paper, the difference seems small. In practice, it was the margin between profit and loss for a railroad facing shrinking coal tonnage and rising competition from trucks and pipelines. Maintenance records tell an even colder story. For every 1,000 hours an H-8 ran, it demanded 400 hours of shop time, grinding valves, repacking rods, and lapping cylinder heads. The F-7 needed just 150. Crew costs fell by nearly a third with diesel, and fuel expense dropped almost in half. The H-8's appetite for coal and water, once a badge of power, now looked like a liability compared to the diesel's streamlined refueling and longer intervals between overhauls. By 1951, the board had approved a $45 million diesel procurement program. The decision did not hinge on nostalgia or pride, but on columns of figures that made the future clear. The Allegheny's unmatched strength could not compete with the quiet, relentless logic of the ledger. In the end, it was not a lack of power, but the economics of efficiency that sealed the fate of the most formidable locomotive on the rails. Rows of Alleghenys once lined the sidings at Russell and Clifton Forge, their hulking silhouettes stretching into the dusk. In the late 1950s, the order came down: clear the yards. The scrapping campaign moved with unsettling speed. Crews worked by torchlight, cutting through boiler jackets and prying brass builders' plates from steel that had hauled millions of tons. Invoices from regional scrap dealers record entire batches, 6 engines in a single week, another 10 before the month's end vanishing from the roster. Some units disappeared with barely a note, their paperwork lost or never filed. In the rush, at least one engine was left stranded on a remote spur, its fate unrecorded in official ledgers. The process left little room for sentiment. Locomotives that had once dominated the mountains were reduced to piles of metal, their tenders and driving wheels carted off by flat car. Scrap ledgers from 1957 and 1958 list engines by number, but gaps remain. Missing entries, unclaimed boilers, a handful of units simply marked awaiting disposition. The scale of loss is almost impossible to grasp. 58 Alleghenys gone within 3 years, their remains scattered from Kentucky to Virginia. The narrow window for preservation closed almost as soon as it opened, leaving only 2 survivors and a ghostly record of engines that, for a moment, had seemed too powerful to ever disappear. Only 2 Alleghenies escaped the scrappers' torch. Their survival was not a matter of luck, but the result of determined campaigns and paperwork that reads like a ledger of last-minute salvation. In July 1956, Chesapeake in Ohio, number 1601, arrived at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, after a flurry of negotiations and a freight bill totaling $5,600 for the move. Museum board minutes from that summer record a debate over the sheer scale of the donation and how to house a machine longer than a city bus and weighing more than 500,000 pounds. The answer was simple, if not easy. Build the exhibit around it. A fundraising drive by the Friends of Steam raised $12,000, enough to cover transport and the first phase of restoration. Curators insisted the engine be displayed indoors, shielded from the weather that had already claimed so many of its sisters. A decade later, number 1604 faced a more uncertain fate. After years languishing in storage at the Chesapeake and Ohio's diesel shops in Russell, Kentucky, it was offered to the Virginia Museum of Transportation. The acceptance letter from June 1969 describes an engine in rough shape, rusted, missing parts, but still unmistakably an Allegheny. The Blue Ridge Steam Society rallied to raise $8,500, and the locomotive was towed to Roanoke, where it became a static display. Here, too, museum curators weighed the costs and made the hard choice: display, not operation, would be the limit of preservation. These acts of rescue were the exception, not the rule. The paperwork, the donor lists, and the curator's notes all reveal the criteria that decided which giants would be saved and which would vanish. For most, the window closed too quickly. But in these 2 survivors, the scale of what was lost and what was barely saved remains visible, preserved in steel and memory. County land records from 1975 list the field as private property, with no mention of rail equipment liens or official railroad transactions. The deed, stamped and notarized, shows a single owner, a retired fireman known locally for his collection of scrap iron. Oral histories from neighbors recall the engine appearing in the late 1970s, hauled in pieces by tractor from a nearby siding, but never moved again. 3 theories circulate among rail historians and locals alike. Some believe the locomotive is a lost C and O H-8, left off the scrapper's tally and quietly sold for salvage when paperwork lapsed. Others point to the Virginian Railway's AG class, nearly identical in design, suggesting a misidentified cousin abandoned after a failed museum bid. A third story claims the hulk was offered to the Virginia Museum of Transportation in the early 2000s, but restoration costs proved too high. Each version leaves gaps, but all agree. The locomotive has sat undisturbed for decades, its true journey clouded by missing records and fading memories. Census tables from Hinton, West Virginia, tell a story written in numbers. A 12% drop in population occurred between 1950 and 1960. The decline tracks with the last runs of the Allegheny, as steam crews were retrained or let go and families weighed their futures against the railroad's shrinking payroll. School enrollment fell, storefronts emptied, and the steady rhythm of shift changes at the roundhouse faded to silence. Letters to the local paper pleaded for intervention, but the decisions were made far from the valley, in boardrooms and on budget sheets, not on depot platforms. For the men who once fired the big engines, and for the children who grew up in their shadow, the loss ran deeper than economics. The departure of the Allegheny was a wound that left a mark on the landscape and on the memory of every town it once thundered through. Restoring a locomotive of the Allegheny's scale is not just a matter of passion, it is a test of resources that few can pass. Estimates from museum board minutes and engineering consultants place the cost of bringing a rusted H-8 back to static display at over $3 million. To make one operational again would require even more, a sum that overshadows the annual budgets of most railroad museums. The press, once filled with awestruck headlines about record-shattering horsepower, now frames the story in the language of burden and regret. Magazine features from the 1970s and the 2000s shift from celebrating the machine's might to questioning who, if anyone, should shoulder the financial and legal risks of preservation. It is a reminder that the price of memory can be counted in millions, and that the line between legacy and loss is drawn with every dollar not raised. Today, the rusting hulk lingers, silent proof that even unmatched force can be humbled by quiet efficiency. As railroads choose innovation over spectacle, the Allegheny's bones remind us, power alone is never enough to outpace change. Its legacy haunts every field where giants once roared and now fade, asking if we ever truly value greatness until it's gone. Share your thoughts about this lost titan below.